half kneeling hamstring hover. So we're on a pretty hard surface, so I just grabbed some sort of pad to put my knee on so my knee's not pressed into the ground. And then for our hover, we're gonna use a yoga block. There's a million different things you can use in the gym. Simply a kettlebell will work just fine. The reason I prefer a yoga block is it's a little bit easier to scale. There's a different sides I can put it on. So the half kneeling position, this is gonna allow us to relatively lock up our pelvis because the hamstring muscle crosses our hip and our knee. And a lot of times we will predominantly train our hamstring at our hip joint. So when we're in this kneeling position, we're in what we call hip extension or a neutral hip position, maybe even hip flexion. I'll talk about that in a second, depending on your hip sensitivity. But it allows us to train knee flexion down at the knee, and it allows us to train a little bit of hip rotation while our hamstring is engaged by doing the hover component. So with that being said, in your setup position, your amount of hip extension is going to vary depending on many things, right? Depending on your anatomy, your range of motion, any sort of sensitivity that you're dealing with, those types of things. So you're getting into a position where hopefully you can feel yourself contract your glute, but it doesn't irritate your actual hip joint itself. The whole point of the movement is to be able to feel the hamstring working down around your knee. And then the other piece that I want to talk about is the intent with the motion. So maybe going too high creates a ton of cramping in your hamstring because there's more intent behind that motion. So then you go lower to scale it so that way you're not cramping up on every single rep. And then the other piece with the last piece, excuse me, is when you go to do the hover, you're doing your best to not twist at your torso, which is why I like the aid of a foam roller. So you can kind of cue yourself to push down into the foam roller. So that way you're not twisting at your trunk and that really the motion is coming down at that hip. So when I get set up, I'm gonna go in that kneeling position and I want my foam roller next to my ankle. And for me, it doesn't bother me to go into hip extension. So I'm shifting my torso forward a little bit and that puts this bottom leg in a little bit of hip extension. And then I'm pushing down with my foam roller and then I'm contracting at the hamstring and I'm gonna hover over and then down. And then I would reverse back up and over, and that would be an example of one rep. So again, follow the progressions that we just talked about in terms of your range of motion, your sensitivity, those types of things, and pay attention to the intent because this should not be cramping up on you. If you start to cramp really bad, that means the intent is a little bit too high, and adjust it by going with a lower hover. If you're unable to do the hover, meaning going back and forth, because that irritates you to get into that hip rotation, then just simply perform the half kneeling contraction where you're getting the foot to come off the ground and then scale accordingly.